The story begins in a small, forgotten town called Raven's Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The town was known for its eerie silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally devoid of sound. No birds chirped, no wind rustled through the trees, and even the stream that cut through the town seemed to flow noiselessly. The residents spoke in whispers, as if afraid of disturbing something unseen. In this town lived a young woman named Clara. She had grown up in Raven's Hollow and always felt the weight of the silence pressing against her ears. But one winter evening, something shattered that silence. A distant echoing scream that seemed to come from the woods. Clara, unlike most of the townsfolk, was curious and brave. She decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and her father's old hunting knife, she ventured into the dense forest. The further she walked, the more she realized the trees seemed to lean closer, as if watching her. The silence grew heavier, almost oppressive, and she began to feel an unnatural chill. Suddenly, she came upon an abandoned cabin, half buried in the snow. The door creaked open, as if inviting her in. Against her better judgment, Clara stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light of her flashlight. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, and on it sat a music box. She reached out to touch the box, and as soon as her fingers brushed against it, the silence was broken by the most haunting melody she had ever heard. It wasn't just music. It was layered with faint whispers and the sound of someone sobbing. She tried to pull her hand away, but it felt as though the box had gripped her. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "They're waiting for you." The music stopped abruptly, and Clara heard footsteps behind her. Whipping around, she saw nothing. But when she turned back, the chair was empty, and the box was gone. Terrified, she ran out of the cabin and back into the woods, but the path she had taken was gone. The trees now formed an impenetrable wall. Her flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in darkness. The whispers returned, louder and clearer now. They were all around her, coming closer, until a cold hand grabbed her shoulder. She screamed, and in that instant, the flashlight blinked back to life. She was standing in the middle of a clearing, but it wasn't empty. Surrounding her were dozens of figures, pale and hollow-eyed, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Each held a music box, and they all began to play the same haunting tune in unison. One of them stepped forward, a young girl with hollow cheeks and empty eye sockets. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, an unearthly shriek erupted, piercing Clara's ears. She fell to her knees, clutching her head as the world spun around her. When she woke, she was lying on the floor of her bedroom. For a moment, she thought it was all a dream. But on her nightstand sat the music box, its lid slightly ajar. Over the following days, Clara began to hear the melody in her mind, growing louder and more insistent. Her neighbors started avoiding her, muttering about the curse of the woods. And then the screams began, every night, louder and closer. One by one, the townsfolk began to disappear. Their homes stood empty, their belongings untouched. Clara tried to leave the town, but no matter which direction she went, she always ended up back in front of the cabin. On the final night, she decided to face whatever haunted her. She took the music box and returned to the cabin. The figures were waiting for her, their eyes gleaming in the dark. The girl stepped forward again and whispered, "Your turn." Clara's screams echoed through the woods, piercing the silence one last time. The next morning, Raven's Hollow was completely abandoned. The only sign of life was the faint sound of a haunting melody drifting through the air. To this day, hikers who venture near the area report hearing whispers and a faint tune in the distance. Some say, if you hear it, you'll never return. Raven's Hollow remains a ghost town, a place where the silence echoes with the screams of the lost. The story picks up months after Clara's disappearance. Raven's Hollow was now officially marked as abandoned. A faded warning sign at the town's edge read, "Do not enter. Danger ahead." But warnings only attract the curious. One crisp autumn morning, a group of amateur urban explorers set out to document the mysterious town. Their leader, Ryan, was obsessed with ghost stories and urban legends. He had read about Raven's Hollow online and convinced his friends, Emma, Marcus, and Leah, to join him. They arrived at the edge of the forest just as the sun was setting. Emma, the most skeptical of the group, rolled her eyes at the eerie silence. So, no birds, no wind, just sounds like an urban myth, she muttered. Ryan grinned, holding up his camera. Then let's prove it. Come on, we've got the whole night to explore. The group entered the forest, their flashlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. At first it was just quiet, unnervingly so. Every step they took seemed unnaturally loud, the crunch of leaves echoing back at them. Leah, the most superstitious, stopped suddenly. "Do you guys feel that?" she whispered. The air had grown cold, and an oppressive weight seemed to settle over them. "It's like we're being watched." Marcus laughed nervously. "It's just your imagination. Let's keep moving." As they approached the town, the group noticed the buildings were strangely intact. The homes looked as though their occupants had vanished overnight. Plates of moldy food sat on tables, children's toys were strewn across lawns, and the windows stared back at them like black, hollow eyes. Ryan led them to the town square, where a rusted bell tower loomed. "This is where the music box was found," he said, consulting a map he'd printed. Emma frowned. "What music box?" Ryan hesitated before explaining the legend. "They say a woman found it in the woods and it drove her mad. Everyone who hears its tune vanishes. The town's silence. It's not natural. It's waiting." Leah shivered. "Waiting for what?" Ryan shrugged. "Nobody knows, but that's why we're here, to find out." As the group explored further, they found a trail leading to the woods. At the end of the trail stood the infamous cabin. Its door was ajar, swinging slightly in the windless air. Leah refused to go inside. "This feels wrong," she whispered, standing at the edge of the clearing. "We shouldn't be here." Ryan ignored her and stepped in first, his camera capturing every detail. The cabin was just as the stories described, dusty, decayed, and eerily empty. In the center of the room sat the chair, and on it, the music box. Emma leaned closer, her skepticism faltering. "Is that it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ryan reached for the box. The moment his fingers touched it, the haunting melody began to play. The sound was soft at first, almost beautiful, but soon it twisted into something darker. Whispers began to seep through the air, indistinct at first, but growing louder. Leah screamed from outside. "Stop! Don't touch it!" Ryan pulled his hand away, but the music didn't stop. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, low and menacing. "You were warned." Suddenly, the door of the cabin slammed shut. The air grew thick, and the temperature dropped sharply. Marcus shouted, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Inside, Ryan and Emma watched in horror as shadows began to gather in the corners of the room. They weren't just shadows. They were figures, pale and hollow-eyed, just as Clara had described. The music swelled, and the shadows began to move toward them. "What do we do?" Emma cried, panic setting in. Ryan tried to pick up the music box, thinking it might stop the madness, but the moment he touched it, the figures froze. One stepped forward, a tall man with a face twisted in agony. He reached out, and Ryan felt an icy grip close around his wrist. "Your turn," the shadow whispered. Leah and Marcus heard the screams from inside, piercing, blood-curdling, and unlike anything human. They tried to break down the door, but when they finally forced it open, the cabin was empty. Ryan and Emma were gone. The music box sat on the chair, its lid closed. Leah and Marcus fled the town, leaving their gear behind. They never spoke of what happened, but rumors spread when their footage was leaked online. In the grainy video, just before the screams began, viewers can hear the melody faintly. Some claim to hear whispers in the background, calling out names. Not long after, people who watched the footage started disappearing. The legend of Raven's Hollow grew, spreading far beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And somewhere in the woods, the music box waits, its tune echoing softly in the silence. Months after the disappearance of Ryan and Emma, the footage leaked online caused a stir among paranormal enthusiasts. A group of professional ghost hunters, calling themselves the Spectral Seekers, decided to take on the challenge of investigating Raven's Hollow. The team consisted of Claire, the lead investigator, Mason, the tech expert, Ava, the medium, and Joel, the skeptic. Claire had seen the footage and couldn't shake the whispers in the background. "This is different," she told the group during their planning meeting. "We're not just dealing with a haunted town. This feels alive." The group set out in the early evening, carrying high-tech equipment, including thermal cameras, EVP recorders, and EMF detectors. They planned to document everything, but as they approached the town, Ava began to feel uneasy. She stopped suddenly, clutching her stomach. "What's wrong?" Mason asked, adjusting the EMF detector. "There's something watching us," Ava whispered, her voice trembling. "It knows we're coming." Joel rolled his eyes. "Classic. Let's get to the spooky part already." The group entered Raven's Hollow as the sun dipped below the horizon. The silence hit them immediately, a profound, unnatural quiet that made even their breathing sound intrusive. Claire checked her recorder. It was picking up static, despite the lack of wind or interference. As they ventured deeper into the town, the group noticed that the houses were in a worse state than the footage had shown. Windows were shattered, walls were blackened as if burned, and strange symbols were etched into the wood. Ava paused to examine one of the symbols, her face pale. "These are warding marks," she said. "Whoever lived here was trying to keep something out, or in." Claire took a picture and motioned for the group to keep moving. Their destination was the cabin, where they hoped to find the music box. The cabin loomed in the darkness, its door slightly ajar. The air around it felt heavier, as if the forest itself were pressing in. Mason set up a thermal camera outside, while Claire and Joel stepped inside. Ava lingered near the entrance, her hands shaking. Inside, the cabin was eerily untouched. Dust coated every surface, and the chair still sat in the center of the room. The music box was gone, but the faint sound of its haunting melody seemed to echo in the distance. Joel walked to the chair and tapped it with his flashlight. "So where's the cursed box? Did it grow legs and walk away?" Claire ignored him, scanning the room with her EMF detector. The readings spiked violently near the chair, and the temperature dropped several degrees. "Something's here," Claire whispered. "It's watching us." Suddenly, Ava screamed from outside. Claire and Joel rushed out to find her staring into the woods, her eyes wide with terror. "I saw them," she gasped. "The shadows, they're moving." Mason pointed the thermal camera toward the forest. The screen flickered, and for a moment, humanoid shapes appeared, cold, featureless, and shifting. Then the camera shut off abruptly. "We're not alone," Mason muttered, trying to restart the device. The group decided to leave the cabin, but as they stepped away, the door slammed shut behind them. The sound echoed unnaturally through the woods. Ava clutched Claire's arm. "It's angry. We shouldn't have come here." The melody of the music box grew louder, though none of them could tell where it was coming from. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees casting long, twisted shadows. Joel, trying to keep his composure, turned on his flashlight. The beam illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, a young girl with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. She tilted her head and whispered, "Your turn." The group froze as the girl stepped forward, her footsteps eerily silent. Behind her, more figures emerged, their pale faces glowing faintly in the dark. Each carried a music box, and together they began to play the same haunting tune. Claire screamed as the shadows surged toward them. "Run!" she shouted, grabbing Ava and Mason. They bolted toward the town square, but the figures followed, their forms twisting and elongating. Joel tripped and fell, his flashlight skittering away. The group turned back to help him, but he was already surrounded. The shadows engulfed him, and his screams echoed briefly before fading into silence. Claire, Ava, and Mason managed to escape the town, but not unscathed. Ava refused to speak about what she saw, her eyes haunted. Mason reviewed the footage, but every frame was corrupted, showing only static and faint, ghostly whispers. Claire tried to warn others about the danger, but the story only fueled the legend of Raven's Hollow. Paranormal enthusiasts flocked to the area, many of them never returning. 1 month later, Claire woke in the middle of the night to a familiar sound. The music box melody echoed softly through her apartment. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, and a whisper filled the air. "Your turn." Claire sat frozen in her bed, heart pounding as the haunting melody of the music box filled her apartment. Shadows crept along the walls, their shapes twisting unnaturally. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, but the screen flickered and died as soon as she touched it. The melody grew louder, as if the source was moving closer. Claire's breath hitched when she noticed her bedroom door slowly creaking open. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but within that darkness, she could make out a figure, a childlike silhouette with hollow eyes staring at her. "Your turn," the figure whispered, its voice distorted and layered with multiple tones. Claire screamed and grabbed the baseball bat she kept under her bed. She swung it wildly as the figure stepped into the room, but her bat passed through it like smoke. The shadows swirled around her, and she felt icy hands grasp her wrists, pinning her against the wall. The figure leaned closer, its twisted smile widening unnaturally. "You shouldn't have come to Raven's Hollow," it hissed. "Now you belong to us." Just as Claire felt herself being pulled into the darkness, a blinding flash of light filled the room. The shadows recoiled, and the figure vanished with a piercing shriek. Claire dropped to the floor, gasping for air. The light came from the flashlight she had taken from Mason, now lying on the ground. Shaking, she grabbed the flashlight and ran out of her apartment. The melody still echoed faintly, but it seemed to follow her, as if the source was inside her mind. Claire drove aimlessly, not knowing where to go, but desperate to put as much distance between herself and her apartment as possible. She finally stopped at an all-night diner on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The bright fluorescent lights and the hum of conversation offered a brief sense of normalcy. She ordered coffee, her hands trembling as she recounted the events to herself. That's when she noticed the man sitting at the counter staring at her. He was pale, with sunken eyes and a distant expression. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "You heard the melody, didn't you?" Claire's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man introduced himself as Harold, a former resident of Raven's Hollow. He explained that he had fled the town decades ago after witnessing his family disappear one by one. "The music box chooses its victims," he said. "Once you hear its song, it's only a matter of time." Harold revealed what he knew about the music box. According to local legend, it had been crafted in the 1800s by a grieving father named Elias Corbin. After losing his daughter to a mysterious illness, Elias became obsessed with the occult. He believed he could trap her spirit in the music box and bring her back to life. Elias succeeded, but at a terrible cost. The ritual didn't just bind his daughter's soul. It awakened something far darker. The box became a vessel for a malevolent force, feeding on those who dared to listen to its tune. Elias was the first victim, and the curse spread to anyone who came into contact with the box. Harold leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The only way to escape it is to destroy the box." Claire shook her head. "We searched the cabin, it wasn't there." Harold's expression darkened. "That's because the box moves. It calls to its next victim, appearing wherever it's needed. But there's a way to find it." He slid a weathered journal across the table. It was filled with sketches of the music box and notes about rituals and symbols. "This will help you," Harold said, "but be warned, destroying it might cost you more than your life." Determined to end the nightmare, Claire studied the journal. It described a ritual to summon the music box, but it required specific items: a shard of glass from a haunted mirror, a lock of hair from someone who had heard the melody, and soil from a cursed graveyard. Claire reached out to Mason, the only other survivor of their group, and convinced him to join her. Reluctantly, he agreed, bringing his equipment and a healthy dose of skepticism. "You really think this will work?" he asked, as they drove toward the first location, a derelict mansion rumored to have a haunted mirror. The mansion was a labyrinth of decayed hallways and shattered furniture. In the dining room, they found the mirror, a massive, cracked piece of glass that reflected the room in eerie distortions. As Mason carefully pried a shard loose, the mirror began to bleed a dark, viscous liquid. Whispering voices filled the air, urging them to look into the glass. Claire yanked Mason away, and they fled the house with the shard in hand. "One down, 2 to go," she muttered, though the dread in her chest was growing heavier. Their next stop was Ava's home. Claire hadn't spoken to her since the night they fled Raven's Hollow. When they arrived, they found the house abandoned. Inside, they discovered Ava's journal, filled with frantic scribbles about the shadows and the melody. In her bedroom, they found a brush with strands of her hair still tangled in it. But as they turned to leave, the temperature dropped, and the shadows in the room began to move. The whispers returned, louder and angrier this time. Mason's camera caught flickering images of figures lurking just beyond the edge of the light. "We need to go, now," Claire shouted, dragging Mason out of the house. The final item required them to visit a notorious graveyard, known as Widow's Rest, where countless unmarked graves were said to hold restless spirits. As they dug up a small patch of soil, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Faint cries echoed around them, and skeletal hands clawed their way out of the earth. Mason screamed as one of the hands grabbed his ankle, pulling him down. Claire swung a shovel, breaking him free, and the two of them sprinted back to the car, narrowly escaping the rising dead. With all 3 items in hand, Claire and Mason prepared for the ritual in a remote clearing far from any town. They followed the instructions in the journal, drawing symbols in the dirt and lighting black candles. As they placed the items in the center of the circle, the air grew still. The melody began to play, faint at first, but growing louder. The music box appeared in the center of the circle, its lid slowly opening. Shadows swirled around them, and the figures from Raven's Hollow emerged, their hollow eyes fixed on Claire. A voice spoke, low and thunderous. "You think you can end this?" Claire stepped forward, holding a hammer. "I have to try." As she raised the hammer to smash the box, the figures rushed toward her, and the world erupted into chaos.